Hello everybody and welcome to today's BAInsights, and today we'll be talking about interviewing stakeholders, and very pleased to welcome my guest Pam. Before I go any further and introduce Pam, I'll let Pam introduce herself. So Pam, over to you please.
Thank you so much, John. It's very nice to be here today. Coming from Canada, actually. I live in a little city called Kingston, Ontario, and I've been a BA in the area, usually IT, for quite a while. I'm a consultant, so I've worked for over 50 companies. I think that number is up to 60 now, getting a fair smattering of a lot of different industries and best practices. And I'm also a writer. I've written over 11 books, and one of them is coming out in 2025 about stakeholder interviewing.
Excellent, thank you, Pam. And when perhaps you can share the link with me, or if there's a link or some material, and I can share it with the listeners or viewers of this session afterwards, so they can access some of the publications and books that you're referring to.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. So thank you, and once again for joining. So let's dive into the topic of interviewing stakeholders, and maybe let's start first of all with why it's important to interview stakeholders when you're a business analyst.
Thank you for the question, John. So stakeholders are the beginning of every interaction. Every deliverable that we start, every phase that we start involves stakeholders. So it's absolutely critical that we learn how to interview them. And interviewing, if we want to put a definition on it, it's really a conversation with a purpose. You might be interviewing somebody even when you don't know it, even when you're going out to find a new chair and asking the salespeople questions about the chair, the materials, the warranty, or you're going through the drive-through and we're asking about different menu items. We're really conducting an interview because it's a conversation with a purpose. So interviews are really everywhere. I mean, inside and outside of the business analysis context in our work. And it's a really critical skill for business analysts to have.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think that if I think about some of the alternatives to having that, perhaps one-on-one interviews or interviewing with a smaller group, is sometimes I have a big workshop where all stakeholders can theoretically share their opinions and get involved. I find that it's not always easy for every individual stakeholder to give the time in that session, or to be given the opportunity to share what we want them to share and what they'd like to share. So I think it's really valuable having a stakeholder interview, because you get to meet the person, understand a little bit about who they are and what they want, and give them the time to actually share information about their needs or their situation or what their view is on the requirement, depending on why you're approaching them. So I think they're all reasons. I think as well, I mean, based on some of the points you made as well, I mean, I think it's so key having stakeholders as part of analysis, because really without stakeholders, the BAs are effectively making up the material, and then we drift from being business analysts to novelists probably.
Yes, and I think you really hit on an important point. You said it very quickly, but I actually want to bring people back to the point. When you're in a workshop, do we give the opportunity to stakeholders to speak? And I think that's really important, because some stakeholders are shy, or they don't understand how they can fit into the conversation, or maybe they think that even that they shouldn't be saying anything at that time. But when you deliberately and intentionally give that opportunity to stakeholders and make space for them to express what their needs and requirements are, then you're in a better position to get that information back from them. So good on you, John, for making that point.
Yeah, no, and you take it further is really helpful, because actually it also makes me think, Pam, that there's those situations of BA where you're not just maybe doing the interview with a limited number of people first for the benefit of the stakeholders, although I think it does benefit them, but also it can be quite daunting as a BA walking into a room where there's, whether it's a virtual or a real one, where there's a number of stakeholders and you're trying to meet them all for the first time, understand the situation for the first time, maybe gather some useful information for the first time. I think having some prior one-on-one interviews with some key people before that gives you the opportunity to maybe at least know one or two friendly faces in the room beforehand, have met them, and actually maybe got a bit of insight or a bit of knowledge before the bigger workshops as well. So I'm glad you raised that point that you did as well, because it took me in that direction. I wonder then, I mean, if we're talking about stakeholder interviews, wonder how can we and how can BAs prepare for the interviews to ensure that they cover all of the pertinent topics, or perhaps get the outcomes that they require?
I think you kind of started us off by saying, before we get into that workshop for the first time, what can we do before that so it's not the first time, even with a few key stakeholders? I think that's terrific. And, you know, the detail is really important in the advice, right? Because if you check out some common resources, or, you know, I spent the last year writing a book about stakeholder interviewing, and a lot of the resources will say, it involves research. You need to research. And that's pretty much where they stop, which is the problem. Because what kind of research? How much research? How do I do the research, right? So when I talk about this topic, it's just much more elusive than this. And there's a lot of elements to stakeholder interviewing, such as language, cultural differences, the expertise of not only the interviewer, but the interviewee. Are they accustomed to being interviewed? If not, then they're going to need some prep before you go into the actual interview, so that they understand the expectations of what you're looking for. That's going to help you both ultimately. There's also personalities and rapport. And this is so important to navigate these kinds of dynamics. And the first thing that we want to do is learn more about our stakeholders. If we are invited into developing a new system for a company, and we are told by executives that the system is old, it's obsolete, it's breaking down all the time, it's costing a lot of money, and then we go into that first meeting and we say, we know that this system is old, it's breaking down, it's costing a lot of money, but we don't know that those are the same stakeholders who built the system, the old system, then we're off to a bad start. Okay. So it really does begin with knowing our stakeholders and what are their personalities like, their background. I had one stakeholder tell me, and I even thought this was kind of humorous, but it's a very serious thing for him. He said, after 1 o'clock, I'm brain dead. I can't utter another word. I can't be interviewed. You can't get anything out of me. My best time is in the morning. I start at 7 a.m. So I need to pivot, right, to get the best information, because ultimately that's our job too, is to get the best information in the most optimal way out of our stakeholders. So finding out that kind of information is really important as well. You know, if they have never been interviewed before, if they've never worked on a project like this before, well, then our job is baselining information about what a requirement is. So we all have a common understanding, and we are looking at this in a very efficient kind of a way. In the last year or so, I've been using ChatGPT a lot in preparation for interviews. And also, you know, because it's so evolved now, it's almost like talking to another person. It's almost like talking to a friend to get a different perspective. And so I might put in information about the stakeholder, about the project, about the kind of challenges are or risks, and ask ChatGPT, well, what do you think? What do you think are good questions for requirements? And it's just, if I don't use the information, the perspective is very valuable.
Yeah, I would agree. It's very similar to when you're working in a team of BAs and you know that you're approaching maybe a senior stakeholder, a senior client, or someone who might be theoretically difficult. You know, it's difficult. Then it's helpful to play to the team, or at least pick someone from your team who you can, you know, run an idea through, run some new questions through, let them peer review what you intend to do. And I think, you know, GBT or any other Gen AI solution similar to it provides an opportunity to have that stakeholder peer review without actually having to find a teammate to physically come and do it. So yeah, I definitely like that use of GBT and similar technologies to help you prepare as well. And I think from my side, I think preparing for the meeting, and we'll probably talk about research on the individuals in a moment a little bit more, because I think the point you made there is definitely a valid one. It's definitely somewhere we should go as well. I think in wider preparation, I think having a clear purpose and objective for the meeting and sharing that stakeholder interview is very helpful. I think the stakeholders that who are maybe not met you before and they've got this invite coming to their inbox, knowing clearly why it is you want to meet, so they get the opportunity to tell you perhaps if they're the wrong person before we have a meeting that we don't need, or at least on the flip side, when they have agreed to it and they are happy to attend, that if they have a myriad of other meetings in their diary, they can quickly open this one just before it starts, know why you're going to talk to them, get themselves in that right sort of headspace so that they can respond as appropriately and effectively as you need them to as well. So I think that occurs to me. I think as well, and you've mentioned it in terms of preparation, I think having that core set of key questions to accompany your key objectives is useful, because I think for my sake, or from my perspective, there's always like maybe a big list of questions, a big list of topics that you want to cover, probably an excessive list that you're probably not going to cover entirely in that first stakeholder meeting. But it's nice then to be able to take a step back and think, right, maybe I've got 10 things that I want to achieve through my interactions with a stakeholder at some point. But what are the top 5? What's the most important? If we only talk about one, what does it have to be? And I think those points you're making about the questions and maybe using GBT to help you prioritize might be a useful way of thinking about that for others.
Well, can I just jump in about when you're talking about sending out information to stakeholders in advance? I think this is such a pivotal play that a BA can do to have a good meeting. And this agenda or this email, with an agenda, can be in different formats and different forms and containing different information depending on the purpose of your meeting. So, I often talk about the agenda, for example. So sometimes if you have a list of topics, that's enough, because that's where you're at. But if you can have a more directed conversation, you might add the names of the people beside the topics so we know who is speaking. And one of the reasons that we want to do that is everybody is multitasking and everybody is busy, so we know at least when they're going to pay attention to that agenda item, which has their name on it. And if you take it a step further, you're actually adding time. So we're time boxing each of the elements of the agenda. And that would be useful in a meeting where we know each other, we know what the objectives are, we've done this before. It's not so effective, I find, in an initial meeting with stakeholders where we're trying to develop rapport. Our objective is different. We're trying to develop rapport. We're trying to develop a relationship. And so if we time box it to say, meet and greet, 3 minutes, we're not allowing that to develop organically. And this is where I find the concept of form and function, which you find in other disciplines and in biology and so forth, and the long neck of the giraffe. This is where form and function can really lead to meaning and action. And so thank you for bringing in that point about the information that we give stakeholders in advance and how it really shapes our interview for effectiveness.
You once again, you prompted me as well to think a little bit more about that topic, because it makes me think about a project I've been working on recently, and actually, I knew that I had to go and approach a different sets of stakeholders and fundamentally ask them fairly similar questions about what their processes are or maybe what their priorities are. And my assumption and a little bit of insight that I had was that some of these stakeholders wouldn't be particularly well versed in some of the transformation or business analysis terms that we might want to use, and they might find it difficult to visualize what I was expecting of them. So in that situation, actually, my preparation went a little bit beyond a set of questions or an agenda, and merely, what I tried to do is create some theoretical or conceptual use cases, I think they were at the time, to just outline what their answers could be, but without almost pushing the answers onto them. I'm always trying to get that balance, because I certainly don't want to tell people the answers that I want to hear. I want to give them the space to give all the answers that apply to them. But I think sometimes it's useful to give them some examples of what you might expect them to be able to provide. And even if you give them a get out and say, these could all be redundant, none of these could apply to you, but they're an example of what we could be talking about. So thank you for also as well sort of helping me extend that point a little bit further. Thank you as well for mentioning research a little while ago, and you mentioned some things about preparing for the meeting and a little bit of research about a few topics. But I'd be interested to know the level of research that you think is appropriate, or you or a BA might do in terms of researching your stakeholder before meeting them for the first time.
I always do a lot of research about my stakeholders. So I actually have a background in journalism, and that was my undergrad. So it's kind of ingrained in me. It's part of my DNA now. And one of the first things that I do is I Google them and I find out what their background is in terms of their experience, their education, what kind of companies they've worked at. You know, if they worked in sales for 20 years and now they've switched over to accounting, well, it says a lot about them that they perform in kind of the sales characteristics and profile and mentality and approach in a very fast environment for 20 years. And that's how they can operate. And now they've moved into accounting, which is more detailed and slow and analytical. So maybe they're middle-brained. Maybe they have, so I Google them and I try to pull out information about them based on the information that I have. I also ask people who know them. I mean, people, the project manager, the other stakeholders, somebody who's worked with them before, just asking basic questions so that I can work better with them. So I might say, have they worked on this project before? Do they have exposure to IT and requirements before? What do they like to work with? Are they more extroverted or introverted? Because then I'm going to adjust my style to them, the more information that I have. And you can also ask questions like, is the stakeholder excited about this project? You can ask the project manager that. If not, why not? Because, if they're not excited about it, is it because they're overloaded? Are they buried under work? It doesn't affect them. I mean, there's lots of questions that we should be asking even about the stakeholder to other people. And this kind of information, for example, if they're buried under work, if we have that information, we can adjust ourselves. We kind of need to be chameleons as business analysts on every different project. And if we have that kind of information, then maybe we can make some adjustments in our process to better accommodate their busy time. Maybe I've conducted interviews at midnight because that's when the project manager was available. I don't recommend that. It's not best practice, but that's when she was available. And so if we know, the more information that we know about them, the more that we can adjust to fit into their lifestyle. And I've even made jokes about myself, and I might start off a workshop by saying that, hi, my name is not Pamela Paterson. My name is Heavy Lifter. Because I knew that the stakeholders were really, really busy and they didn't want to be on this project because they're so busy. So that's how I started off the workshop. I said, hi, my name is Heavy Lifter, because I'm going to do all the heavy lifting for you. I'm going to do all the work for you. All I need is your knowledge. And I think that stakeholders breathed a collective sigh of relief when they heard this, because, everybody is flattered that we want your knowledge. We want your experience. Everybody is flattered to share their knowledge and their experience, but also that I wouldn't be adding to their heavy workload, but I'd be helping them through it.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, I totally understand and agree with those points as well, but they're all really important, especially about trying to mold yourself around that stakeholder and try and make yourself as accessible to them, so that they're not, then they don't have to inconvenience themselves, as it were, or go against if they've already overworked, to add more work to speak to you. So I definitely like those points as well. There's something that as you were talking there, it reminded me of some advice I was given some while ago, and I say some while ago, we're probably talking 10+ years. I remember being on a course that was, I don't know if it's about stakeholder analysis. It may well have just been about consulting, and somebody, mentioned for the first time about doing as much research as you could on a stakeholder, looking them up on Google and LinkedIn, and and speaking to others, all the good things you mentioned. And he said, some of you might think, is that a little bit creepy? Is that a little bit weird? Just trying to find out as much as you can about people. But I think because we're all trying to use that information for the right reason, the answer is absolutely not. The reason we're doing this research is so that we can understand how best to interact with people, when to interact with them, whether they're even the right people to include, what style of interaction they might need. And all of that's going to help the preparation and mean that they have a better experience from that meeting and we're able to give us what we need and what they ultimately need to share, but in the most appropriate, convenient way. And I tend to think that and find that, where you've done that research and you've demonstrated that awareness of the person, then they become grateful for it, and they certainly can recognise it through your behaviour, rather than it appearing creepy, as I mentioned before. So I sort of took it back to that point.
So this is funny about creepy, because it is said a lot about how creepy it might be to have somebody doing this kind of sleuthing, this private detective work, but consider if we have, say 3 nameless, faceless stakeholder bodies in a workshop that we're walking into. We don't know anything about them. We haven't done any research. One of them is the CEO. One of them is the director of IT. Another one is a customer care agent, and they all work for a bank. And let's suppose that this system goes down. If we don't know who those stakeholders are, we don't know what their interests are, we don't know how to help them, because they all have different perspectives about that same system going down. So the customer care agent, the interest is all of these angry customers calling in worried about their money, right? The director is worried about productivity and about getting this system up. And the CEO is maybe worried about the news media calling and about ending up on the front page of some website or newspaper. And so it's totally to the stakeholder benefit that we do this creeping around and sleuthing about them in an ethical way to better interview them and get information that ultimately helps them as well.
I agree. Yeah, and in a very practical way as well, in a very simple way sometimes. People can just spend a bit of time before they speak to a stakeholder, maybe having a look at the internal directory and seeing, okay, maybe Pam works in a team with 3 other people that I might have already spoken to already. Maybe that might help, because it might mean I can introduce the fact I've spoken to some of your team, but I can also maybe get a view that you're somehow connected to someone else that I'm about to speak to, and maybe that might make sense to bring you together and rather than waste 2 hours, we could have an hour as a collective. That sort of simple research of just looking at the directory, or as you said, as simple as maybe asking others that have worked with that person before to see what they like. So I think so research, as we say, I mean, maybe this won't be the topic and the title for this session, but it just goes to show that this research is really, really valuable, and it can really help the stakeholders that we're engaged with, be as responsive and appreciative of what we're asking of them. And it takes me on actually to a related topic as well, because we've also talked about researching the stakeholder. Also, we can have that really good, well-prepared first meeting, which is, of course, an opportunity to start building rapport with the stakeholder. So I'd be interested, Pam, to hear your perspective on techniques or approaches to develop rapport further with the stakeholders that you work with.
This is a really great question, John, because it's one that I often hear when I do my presentations and webinars, because there's kind of a barrier between, if we don't work in the same area, we don't work beside the cubicle, the same person, there might be kind of a barrier. So how do we break that barrier? How do we build this rapport with our stakeholders? And I really think it's about any other kind of relationship. So when we ask ourselves, how do we build rapport with people? How do we get friends? Part of it is through trust. Can they trust you? And it's through our actions and our words. Do our words line up with our actions? Do our actions line up with our words? And it's also through consistency, isn't it? You know, we need to see consistency in another person in order to have believability about their credibility. Okay. So, do we genuinely care about their interests? Or are we just writing things down? We don't really care about our job. Do we genuinely care? Do we show that? Do we show that we're listening to them? We pick up on what they say and explore it with them and have that going back and forth. You know, are we seeing their requirements show up in our document? Are they seeing that? And part of it, I think, is just being a good person. So we want to get engaged. We feel comfortable developing rapport with people where we have mutual values, a common goal. When people see this kind of person in you, over time, you will be able to develop rapport, just like any other kind of relationship.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, I'm glad you called out listening there to the person. I think that for me is at the core of really building that rapport and making sure that, you know, you go to the trouble of introducing yourselves to somebody. Then you need to spend time listening to what they've got to say, because if you don't, firstly, you won't be able to, well, you won't get any benefit from the conversation yourself. But equally, how are you going to play back what you've heard, what you've understood, what is important to that stakeholder? Because all of those things in terms of playback and showing that understanding, that's what's going to help build that rapport and show, to your point, to show the stakeholder that you actually care about what it is they're saying. Yeah. And I think that can also make me think as well about showing some empathy to their situation. And I know it sometimes can be difficult because we haven't always worked in that same environment. We may not have witnessed or experienced the same processes they have, but there's normally some area of comparison, you know, whether it's tight deadlines, it's systems that don't do things they should, difficult clients, whatever it might be. You know, there's always somewhere that will resonate. And, okay, I can empathize with that because maybe a slightly different situation, but similar. So you can show that you actually get what it is the stakeholders sharing.
I'm so glad that you mentioned empathy. I think it's still very underrated and under talked about in circles. And it's exactly as you said, it's being able to relate, it's being able to apply something that, you know, it's being able to read somebody else, get their needs. And it's very interesting because I do a lot of interviewing, I have a lot of side hustles, I'm on a lot of boards. And empathy was one of the key things that we were looking at recently for a CEO position. And because when you can empathize with somebody, you can get information, you can give information because you're resonating with the way that person receives information. You can gauge whether they've gotten the information. All of that is efficiencies, and it's all productivity. I mean, I think empathy in the workplace is about productivity, and it's about, sure, it's about other things for sure. I mean, it's about having a good relationship and all these other things. But at the end of the day, because workplaces, you know, organizations try to make money or save money, and saving money is making money, then empathy helps a lot with that. I think it's really important. Thank you for saying that.
No, you're welcome. I think it makes me think as well about just having the awareness that is important, and therefore being open to it, and being open, I suppose, to sharing your own experiences, as well as just turning up and asking all the questions and trying to get only information from the stakeholder. Actually, there'll be times where it's appropriate to be open yourself and actually share things that you might have learned, or share your approach, or share things that you think, I'm not really comfortable about it, but I'm going to share it so that the stakeholder I'm working with, they feel like they can be equally as open as well. We certainly don't want them to feel like we're draining information from them and we're a closed book and they're not getting anything back in return. Yeah. I wonder as well, I mean, are there any strategies or approaches or techniques that you've employed for handling, situations where stakeholders are maybe disengaged or unresponsive, whether that's when you're reaching out to them or indeed during engagement, speaking to them?
Yes, you know, that's such a popular topic, isn't it? Difficult stakeholders, responsive.
Pam, I think
And look, also overwhelmingly, I found this to be the case. There's maybe that 5% or so that we can't do anything with, and we know what that 5% is. But it's about digging deep into finding out why that stakeholder is quote unquote difficult. Is it because they're overloaded? Is it because they're having a bad day? They're out of character. They're not normally like this. So it's kind of like finding out what the root cause is. And as business analysts, we are trained in finding out what root cause is through different, want to use the fishbone, want to use the 5 whys, whatever it is, doing some gentle exploration and listening and observing and getting feedback and trying to get to the root cause, which will allow us to facilitate a better solution going forward. And it really is funny how far listening can go. Active listening, feedback, not interrupting our stakeholders, showing that we are listening by writing things down, if you're showing your screen, by typing so they can see that their words are being valued and being written down. Maybe they had a bad experience with another business analyst on a previous project and they're just shut down now. And so now it's about developing the rapport. But I think it's really important to find out what the root cause is and also sharpen our interviewing techniques. If we have an unresponsive stakeholder, is it because they're tongue-tied? Is it because they don't know what to say? Is it because they don't know what we need? So finding about interviewing techniques for specificity helps a lot as well. And I heard recently a really, really good question, which is after a stakeholder is done talking, just say as a knee-jerk reaction, what else? And then be quiet. Because if I'm not talking, then presumably they are.
I feel like I should say what else at that point, Pam, just to prove I was listening there, and I want you on the spot to tell me more on that one. But yeah, I mean, it's certainly some of the things you said there around like even like cutting in and interrupting. I think that feels like a massive no-no to me. I mean, I've been on a lot of in workshops and sessions in the past where the business analyst is telling the stakeholder what their needs are and not spending too much time listening, or every time they do try to get a word in and share what their problem is or share their experiences, the BA is cutting in, and evidently it feels like when they're not cutting in, it feels like they're planning their attack of when they can next come in and they can next speak rather than when they're actually listening. So I think perhaps for any BAs that find themselves doing that, maybe a little check on yourself to try not to interrupt and realise you're there because you're asking someone questions, you're trying to get some information from them. You're not on stage and not performing. It's fine to say no words at all. It's probably a point where I probably should stop talking at that point myself on that one. But I think as far as other situations or stakeholder approaches for unresponsive stakeholders, I think sometimes it's worth remembering that maybe the stakeholder doesn't know they're unresponsive. And the reason I say that is because if we just rely on technology to interact with a stakeholder, reach out to them, then we don't know what's happening on the other side. So, for example, if I send somebody an email and they don't respond to me within 2 or 3 days, maybe if that's the time I want to respond, I have no visibility of whether they've got 1 email in their inbox or 1,000 emails in their inbox. I have no visibility of really whether every time they take a breath, there's someone at their desk asking them questions as well. So what I can do in order to ensure that the reason they're not answering is maybe because they haven't seen the question or they haven't seen the meeting, is maybe think about some different approaches that will help them get awareness perhaps that I've asked them a question, or at least have me ask the question directly to them and know that they're going to respond. So it could be, if I'm able to see the stakeholder, then why send them an email? So for example, a bit of a pet hate of mine, if you can see the person that you've got a question to, and you can see they're not on the phone, it's a pet hate of mine to see when someone emails that person, when it's far easier to stand up and walk over to them and ask the question, which in turn saves me work of writing an email. It saves them the work of responding, and it means we probably get the answer that we need, and it enables that stakeholder to be responsive, you know. Or maybe if that's not possible because we're working remotely and we're in different locations, sometimes, you know, if something is particularly urgent and you suspect they maybe haven't seen your question, then use another medium to ask that question, maybe ping them through Teams or Zoom, but don't badger them, you know, and in that way we can at least rule out whether they are really being unresponsive or whether they haven't even seen the message in the first place. That's probably all I'll say on that one.
So I'm hearing two things here. I'm hearing don't make assumptions and be open to different solutions. And I think this is fantastic because it's the business analyst taking ownership of this problem and actively trying to find a solution without making any assumptions. So we're doing really a lot of exploration and using business analysis skills to find a solution for this communication problem. And you know, communication can be really an elusive thing sometimes. And if the stakeholder, you ask a question, the stakeholder says, no. I mean, they could just be a very introverted person. And so the onus is on us to have a backup plan for that communication and have different, it's almost like having a process map, which is our main flow, and then having some alternate and exception flows lined up just in case that communication doesn't go so well because the stakeholder has different communication means or methods or strengths. And so I really like that about not making assumptions and also being open to different solutions and finding a solution. And that's part of our job.
Yeah, that's right. And I think there's many different, it makes me think of different perspectives on that as well, Pam, because sometimes you might be in a meeting with a few different people, maybe an individual and their manager. And whilst it's important to get information from both parties because they both have different roles and they'll see a problem slightly differently, it can be easy in some situations that the one individual will let their manager speak on behalf of them and the team. And actually, you know, as the BA, I want to hear both perspectives. And if I feel that that's what's happening, if I feel that whenever I organise a meeting with these two theoretical individuals, only the manager speaks, then maybe that's the time for me to have maybe a shorter, maybe more informal meeting with the member of staff first to see, you know, is there anything they might want to add? What's their perspective? Do they see any problems on their side? They're at a different level than like a management observation level in that sense, because it will give us the insight that we need to make sure we've got a full awareness of the problem from all directions, but also that we're not delivering a solution that is just really going to deliver a solution to the person who's observing the outcome of the problem rather than the person who's witnessing the problem or experiencing it. So that's what you just said made me think of that, Beth. I wonder, and as we talk about stakeholders, and they're obviously super important. You know, we talked about as well how we engage with them, how we prepare for meetings, and how we speak to them generally, and how we conduct ourselves. It's important then to think about, well, how do we make sure that the information we're receiving from those stakeholders, that we comprehensively and accurately record it or take it away? I wonder, do you have any techniques or advice for that one?
One thing is to think about an iterative approach to your communication and to know and to kind of build into your timelines that I'm going to interview, I'm going to have all these questions. I'm going to consider this an iterative process so that I might need to circle back and explore some of these answers in more detail. I need to plan that into, you know, not to have one interview, click a checkbox and say, okay, I did it, we're done, but to think of it in an iterative way. And maybe it also means going to other stakeholders, asking the same questions, getting a little bit more detail, getting different perspective. I think the perspectives and the more that you get is really added value to the information. And I think that's probably the best thing that I could offer at this point is just getting multiple perspectives and considering it's an iterative process. And, you know, as opposed to a waterfall process, you know, where you write all your questions in advance, you go through robotically, question, answer, question, answer, question, answer. Okay, it's done. Okay, let's move on to the next. You always want to think of it as a cyclical process.
That's right. Yeah, and that doesn't then put you under pressure as well to have to come up with every question, every answer, and squeeze all the time. It means that and it actually makes things more interesting as well, right? As a BA, no one wants to just go in and ask the same questions to every stakeholder that they ever speak to on every project. You know, it's quite nice to react differently to different stakeholders and test yourself in different situations, for one thing. So I think having a more iterative approach means that you can maybe go with a few questions, but then you can adapt to what you're hearing, or recognize that maybe the conversation's not going in the direction you thought it might, because the stakeholder has a different level of expertise, or their perspective is different than you might imagine. But then being able and adaptive enough to react to it and to take it in follow the direction that you're being led to, and actually give the stakeholder the opportunity to really get all of their message and their information across. So I like that sort of iterative, agile approach to the session as well, and the interaction. Makes me think as well, if I ever think about my own notes in terms of clearly being understood and making sure what we've heard is comprehensive. I think the only thing I might add to that is just taking the opportunity for playback. If you've spent the time taking all the advice that the likes of yourself, Pam, you spoke about over the last 40 minutes, and you've listened and you've heard information from the stakeholder. I think it's then important to try and play back what you've heard, or ideally, if you've been recording this information, whether it's in a process flow or a diagram or a mind map or something else, it's perfectly fine to play it back or show the stakeholder what you've perceived from the session, so that there's less likelihood of you walking out and having the wrong information. I think the only point of care I would say on that, if your writing's anything as bad as my handwriting, then maybe not just turning it around showing you notepad isn't always effective. But if you've got some tools to capture the models or the process or some of your thoughts on paper, then I think that can be quite effective to show stakeholders that you've really understood what they need. And of course, gives them the opportunity as well. If you haven't, they can course correct you before you go away and give someone wrong information.
So on that point, one of the things that I do and I try to do is show my screen when I'm having an interview, and to develop a process map, to document requirements, whatever it is. And one of the things that this does, in addition to capturing accurate information, it also allows them to focus on your screen, give them a point of focus, which helps with attention. And it also helps modulate the meeting. So if you have a stakeholder who is speaking so quickly, and you're always, it's so hard to keep up to them. It's so hard to take notes. It's just because, and also maybe they're a creative person with a lot of different tangents and they speak very fast. And this modulates the meeting because they can actually see that you haven't caught up yet. And it also helps, one of the things that I say is this is like an online review. If you have 10 sets of eyes looking at this content and everybody's looking at it, I mean, when are you ever going to get 10 sets of eyes actually diligently looking at your content other than in this meeting? So I think that's a terrific idea, what you mentioned.
I mean, it makes me think as well, for those that are a bit more monologue, then if you haven't necessarily got a screen, rather than conduct the interview of what me being one side of the desk, the stakeholder being the other side. If actually what I'm doing is drawing a few things from what I've heard of the session, maybe it's easier if I get a bit closer to the stakeholder, or at least on the same side, so they can see what it is I'm drawing, and they can course correct me if I'm wrong, or at least appreciate, maybe if they want to, some of the BA's techniques that we're using to capture their information or their situation as well. I think probably one other question I think we'll move on to is just in terms of if there is a sensitive or potentially contentious issues that we need to talk about with stakeholders. Is there any advice that you might give BAs in handling that situation?
Well, this is a really interesting question, because I find that we're on the same side. And I really am on the same side as my stakeholders, which is to get needs and requirements and process maps and all these kinds of deliverables done for this project. You know, we're not in law enforcement, I guess, when sorry about this little guy here. We're not in law enforcement, for example, where we have daily, routinely set up in contentious situations with others. We're trying to get information from uncooperative people. So something sensitive, potentially contentious, I don't know what that would be. Um, I guess maybe if you had an example, I'm not sure if you do.
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe something that might be sensitive. You were speaking to stakeholders, and you were there as an analyst to maybe do some cost-saving analysis that potentially might result in not necessarily their job being removed, but someone else's. That feels like a fairly sensitive situation. Thankfully, it's not a situation that we're faced with on every project, but it can happen.
So this is an excellent example, and it happens. It does happen for sure. It happens, and the thing that I do is mitigation in this case. And I would identify all of these kinds of contentious issues at the beginning of my effort in business analysis and project management, because I also manage projects, and identify what the risks are and how we're going to handle them. And this is definitely a risk to stakeholder engagement. It's a risk to team morale on the project, and figuring out a communication strategy around this. So groupthink is really important here. If it's one man or one individual person trying to come up with an answer to this very sensitive topic, then that's difficult, because again, you lack perspective about how everybody's feeling, or how different levels are feeling, or different groups are feeling. And so that's really important, is to group think this as much as possible with other team members on the project. Mitigation is 100% a really good, because, you know, sometimes there are, you know, because of cost savings, or the IT project is coming in, it's much more efficient. Maybe there are jobs going to be lost, but maybe the plan is that these people are going to be reallocated to different jobs. Maybe they'll be given the opportunity to retirement, you know, to retire early or something like that.
Yeah,
And, but don't allow that fear to settle into the project team members and the stakeholders, but use good communication to talk that through and make sure that they understand the different options and alternatives, and mitigate it. You know, talk
that's right.
about it before it happens.
And I think in that situation, and probably similar situations as well, maybe it's a case of advising the stakeholders that maybe this is an opportunity to, through your analysis, to shed some light on reality, and share the light that it's not just as simple as moving your role. There's more things that might come together. So I think, but I definitely think what I've said there very much relates to what you said about being on the same team. And you are, as a BA, you're not a representative of the management only, or the person that's brought you into the organization. You're a representative of the organization, the stakeholders that you meet, every stakeholder you meet in actual fact, as well as the person that you brought in. So it's important for everybody's concern that you balance that and you represent everyone as fairly as you can as a BA. So I think, speaking of fairness, I think I will call a close to the session, because it's I don't want to take too much time up, man. I felt like at one point asking a question of maybe at the end whether you and I have adhered to all of these things that we've been talking about. But I feel we've done a good job. But if anyone else wants to go out and QA the session, by all means. But I feel like we've listened correctly to each other and given and respectfully. I think you know, certainly what you've said, I've been able to empathise with entirely and understand entirely, because you've been clear in the way you've described it. I think the communication we had before this session as well meant that we were both on the same page in terms of what we were about to talk about and why. So I feel like we've been doing at least many of the things that we've been talking about over the hour. But if you or anyone else has a disagreement on that, you can let me know, or anyone else in the comments, of course.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. It's been a pleasure to speak with you today, John.
Likewise, Pam. And I'll look forward to, whether it's through your books or through other interactions, hearing more from you in the future. And I'll be sure to get the links as well of any titles that we can share, and I'll share those in the link. But thank you again, Pam, for your time and your expertise on stakeholder interviews. Thank you. And thank you everybody for listening, by the way.